Revolution of common sense.
Revolution of common sense.
A revolution of common sense.
Truth was once common sense, but today, truth is uncommon. Explore biblical truths around faith, business, and politics with Peter Demas. Uncommon Sense in Current Times.
Hey folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. I'm here today with Scott Powell. He is the author of the book Rediscovering America, How the National Holidays Tell an Amazing Story About Who We Are. In addition to getting his bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Chicago, he got his PhD from Boston University. He's founded two businesses. He is a fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution and a currently senior fellow at the Discovery Institute. The Discovery's mission is to communicate that humans and nature are a result of intelligent design rather than the result of blind, just undirected process. He's written countless articles, 250-something articles in the Wall Street Journal, New York Post, etc. Just all over the place. So, Scott, I appreciate you being here. Welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times.
Well, it's a pleasure, Peter. I'm glad to be with you.
So your whole book is obviously, the whole book on it is just talking about the national holidays and the story of who we are. So I guess, why does it matter? Like right now, why does American history matter? Why does it matter to us, connecting to us in that past? Why does that matter at all?
Well, one reason I wrote the book, there were several reasons, but one is I felt that historians do a very good job of describing who, what, when, and where. But they don't do as good a job in answering the question of why. Why did things happen the way that they did? And they also, as a group of people, historians tend to be rather secular. They really don't have a context, a spiritual context to interpreting the events that they're chronicling. And of course, there's a deep spiritual history behind Israel. There's a deep spiritual history behind America. And when we would try to explain the Middle East and why things happen the way they do there, we'd have to talk about Sharia, we'd have to talk about the jihad and the ideas behind, the radical Muslim ideas that drive this behavior. Now, we're fortunate in that the ideas that drove America were largely Christian ideas. But in any case, history matters because, first of all, we would hope that we could learn from history. We don't do a very good job of that, and probably that just reflects human nature to some extent. But still, there's so many lessons in history, and that's one reason that it matters. But it also matters because we are shaped by the ideas of our heritage, and if we like our heritage or we respect and can see its benefits, then we should try to sustain some continuity, because civilizations are based on a continuity of ideas and beliefs, by and large. We could call them values as well. And so history matters a great deal. And when we depart from our heritage, as we have really in the last 60 years, we run into difficulties as a nation.
So when you look at our history and you say you look at our values, and you mentioned Sharia law for the Middle East, our history is rooted in your book. Your book maintains that our history was rooted in a religious liberty there, and I believe you kind of really touch on this a lot in the chapter on Thanksgiving that you have with the Puritans and Pilgrims. So can you kind of describe the difference? Because kind of growing up, you the Thanksgiving thing you addressed as the Pilgrim or the Indian, and you never really kind of understood it more outside of the little square hat things that you had on your hat. So can you kind of talk about the difference of that?
Oh, I'd be glad to. Oh, well, first of all, America was largely influenced by something that happened earlier. It was called the Reformation, and the Reformation of Christianity was a sort of a purification, if you will. It was a getting back to God's word, the teachings in the Bible, and away from the traditions that had developed in the Catholic Church. And in the case of the Pilgrims, they were entirely driven by their religious beliefs. they had been persecuted in Great Britain. There was a Church of England, which had a lot of the trappings of the old Catholic Church. And people that were, really in the biblical word, felt that the Church of England didn't, was somewhat corrupted, if you will, by these trappings of formality and they sought to form their own church. Well, they couldn't. They were persecuted. They were not allowed to form a church, so they were called the Separatists. And finally, they fled England and went to Holland, where they lived for about 10 or 11 years. And meanwhile, the Jamestown colony had been formed, and word got back to them that the New World beckoned, that there may be opportunity to go to the New World. And so they decided that that's what they were called to go to the New World, if you will. And when they were sponsored by the Virginia Company in London, they were outfitted with a ship, the Mayflower, and another ship called the Speedwell. The Speedwell was a leaky boat, and they ultimately had to abandon it and bring more people onto the Mayflower. So it's a very crowded ship. It was only 92 feet long.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And they had 102 people on a 92-foot ship.
I don't picture that. Like, when you think about history, you think about like a gigantic boat, but 92 feet, that's nothing. That's field goal range. I mean, really is.
That's right. Well, anyway, so they made a false start because the speedboat was leaking. They had to turn back, but finally they got off. They got off a little bit late. I believe they left Britain in September, and you're getting into the hurricane season and more violent weather. But nonetheless, they left, and they were destined to go, or they thought they were going to the plot of land that was given to them by the Virginia Company, that was sort of northern New Jersey, the mouth of the Hudson River, that area. Well, they were blown off course. They encountered some horrible stormy weather. The main beam in the ship broke, but was fractured, and they could have sunk, but the ingenuity of the people on board, they got out what's known as a house jack and jacked up that beam, and they survived. But they realized they couldn't go to where they were supposed to go, and they were blown off course. And their first land was really in Cape Cod, where they saw land ho was Cape Cod, which later became Massachusetts. And they decided they needed to find a good place there, and they ultimately found Plymouth, a place called that was named Plymouth after Plymouth in Britain. They named it Plymouth, but it was a place that had fresh water, good farmland, and fortunately very friendly Indians. But they came in December. They really arrived and got established in December. That is very cold weather in that part of America. And they lost almost half their people that winter. It was a normal New England cold winter. These folks, had made it across the ocean only to face great hardship. And 3 whole families were wiped out. But in any case, the survivors, got through the winter. Fortunately, the Indians around there were friendly Indians. They could have arrived in some place where there were hostile Indians, but the Indians were quite friendly. And there was one Indian in particular that befriended them called Squanto. And Squanto, interestingly enough, had been kidnapped and gone to Europe, and where he learned English. He spent time in Great Britain and then came back. So he was sort of the interlocutor between the English-speaking Pilgrims and the great, the great Massasoit, who was the chief Sachem of all the Indians. And the first thing that the Pilgrims did was to, well, I should say that the first important thing the Pilgrims did was to establish a Mayflower Compact.
Right. I was going to, yeah. Now the Mayflower Compact, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the Mayflower Compact, my understanding of it is that's actually where the beginning of the U.S. Constitution started from, wasn't it?
In the sense that it derived from the consent of the people, yes. The Mayflower Compact basically gave everyone an equal voice in the governing of the colony, and this is before they actually arrived on land. The Mayflower Compact was drafted on the Mayflower off Cape Cod. And the reason that they did this was that there was a semi-mutiny going on. The Mayflower had not just the separatists aboard. About half the people that we call the Pilgrims were Christian separatists, and the other people were craftsmen and tradesmen. And Miles Standish, of course, was a military man. So there was division, and they decided that if we're going to an unknown place, we need to stay together. And so the Mayflower Compact, just one page, was drafted up, and it was asked for everyone to sign it. All the men aboard signed this. Christians and non-Christians alike signed this commitment to honoring everybody equally and to governing themselves by the consent of the majority. So that is essentially you could say that was the foundational document for the Constitution. That's true. And they practiced that. When they finally did arrive, they, as I said, they were fortunate having friendly Indians. So one of the first things they did was they brokered a peace deal with the Indians. And it was to be a 50-year treaty, which in the end was honored. They did not get into war, no fighting, whereas the Jamestown colony was always having problems with Indian raids and so forth. So that was an important accomplishment. They made it through the first winter, lost a lot of their people. The Indians showed them how to grow corn. They'd never seen corn before, how to fish successfully, how to hunt. Of course, they knew some of these things, but unique to that area, the Indians really showed them this is how you can get a good harvest. But the harvest was meager that first year, but nonetheless, the Pilgrims wanted to give thanks, and they wanted to extend that thanks to the Indians, and that constitutes what came to be Thanksgiving. And Thanksgiving, believe it or not, was a 3-day celebration. And had the Indians not shown up, there really might not been enough food, because, as I said, the harvest of the Pilgrims was a bit meager. But the Indians showed up with 5 deer that they had shot. Of course, there were turkeys, there were fish, there was plenty of food. So it ended up being a 3-day celebration of giving thanks to God that they had survived and that they had a new beginning in their lives.
So part of the reason with like the reason why they came, part of the compact, the agreement that they had coming together, you had people that were coming there that were rebels in a way. I mean, they were rebelling against the Church of England. They were doing that. Is that where Jamestown obviously didn't have the same impact, the same it almost failed. So my question now is, did that impact of the success of from the Pilgrims, did that impact have on them like what ended up eventually leading into the Revolutionary War? I mean, did the Mayflower Compact impact the Declaration of Independence? Did the spirit of the people that came, did that impact the spirit of us and future people that came here that would say, hey, look, this is where we should start with the birth of a nation and new independence?
Yeah. Well, I probably should add another backstory to this, and that was the character of the leaders of the Pilgrims, William Bradford. And I should also add that 10 years after the Pilgrims colonized Plymouth, Massachusetts, John Winthrop led another voyage. It was actually larger. He had more people settled in the Boston and the North Boston area, and these were called the Puritans. And both the Pilgrims and the Puritans shared a similar belief that was well articulated. We have, the written word, we have historical records of what they said, and they likened their crossing the ocean to go to the New World. They likened themselves to the Israelite leaving the bondage of Egypt and going to the promised land. In other words, their vision, even though it was an unknown world, their vision was nonetheless that it would be the promised land. And that was true for the Puritans. John Winthrop gave that speech, and William Bradford did as well.
And which one was known as the people of the book? Was that the Puritans or the Pilgrims? I know that there's just the famous image of them walking, carrying their Bibles is the reason why I know, because the Bibles weren't small little pocket Bibles, they were gigantic. So I've seen like the pictures of it and where they were called such, but I can't remember which one of the group it was. But clearly their start was obviously, and since they had that analogy, their start was very religious in nature, which is
very much so, very much so.
So
when we get to the next part, the Revolutionary War, I can go into more detail of the character of the people that.
Yeah, I guess did that one again? Or I guess what I'm asking is did that have the impact on was it? Did that have the impact on the people of the Revolutionary War? I mean, what's the approximate timeline between like the Declaration of Independence and by the time the first Thanksgiving came around? We're not talking about generations, are we?
Well, it's significant time. It's about 155 years.
Okay.
20 to 1775.
Okay. Can you trace back, or can you see where that connection is between the two holidays per se, or between the two groups that came from there? That ended up leading to the idea behind this idea that would lead to the Declaration of Independence.
I think so, but I think the most important thing was that these were Christian people.
Right.
That the Pilgrims and the Puritans both were very oriented around wanting to live their lives according to their understanding that came out of the Bible, and they didn't agree in every way. There were differences of views between the Pilgrims and the Puritans, and as a matter of fact, they really didn't have much interaction with each other, even though it was only about a 40-mile difference from Plymouth to Boston. It was about 40 miles. But nonetheless, they were separate. And the Puritans, their colony grew quite rapidly. See, the Pilgrims, when they came to the New World, they were not money motivated at all. They wanted to live Christian lives. They recognized that if they could feed themselves and raise their children, family formation, and raise children, that life would be good and that God would lead them. The Puritans were a little bit different, and in some ways, what may define their character, what drove them, could have been a little bit like what Max Weber articulated in the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and that is that if you took away the Catholic Church from the confidence of people of knowing that they'd be saved, because the church guarantees their salvation, and you're on your own as a Protestant, you're independent. You have your Bible, but you don't have the same formal structure. And there's a little uncertainty. Weber said that there's a little bit of uncertainty in the Protestant mind if they were really good enough. And this drove them to work very hard.
So is it
were very productive people, and their colony really flourished. By the second generation, there were wealthy people in Boston who came from nothing.
Well, now, yeah. So is it that idea that really stemmed from the Protestant Revolution, going back to Martin Luther? Is that again? Was that a one of those pieces that obviously didn't impact the U.S. directly because we weren't even around at the time? But is that one of the things that led us, that thought process that led us to be able to to start with the birth of America?
Absolutely. I think it's safe to say that had there been no Protestant Reformation, there would not be the America that we know today.
So what was kind of the theme behind it? Behind the theme with the Protestant reformers, and being able to allow them to overthrow. You listen to modern Christians now. Our job is just to sit back and love one another and approve everybody. There are many who in the church that fall under this, but what you're arguing or alleging, I guess, is that because of this, they were able to say, it is our job and our duty to overthrow another country. Am I correct? Am I summarizing that part of the chapter of the July 4th holiday correctly?
Well, I don't think overthrow another country is right, because we weren't trying to overthrow.
Oh, that's true. That's true. We were just trying
They had a
to
very
get our
large
freedom and
empire. That would have
independence.
been
Yeah.
quite something to overthrow that. We were trying to assert our independence.
Okay.
Saying that, look, we have we're successful people. We want self-government, and the Brits were not giving. The Brits were controlling too many things, especially in commerce and taxation without representation, and a host of other things. Also, the courts were very biased towards the British and not the Americans. And so finally they'd had enough. And so the seeds of the war, of the Revolutionary War, were probably well established by 1773, 1774. And finally, after the Boston Tea Party and a few other things, the colonists in Boston decided to take up arms against the British. And that started in Lexington and Concord. And the people that were the early militia of the so-called patriots all came out of the churches. And you even had pastors that were preaching on Sunday and then would take up arms on Monday.
Did the Great Awakening, like with George Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, did that have an impact on this thought process of we need to preach on Sunday? I think there was a line in a movie that sometimes you have to beat off the wolves as a shepherd. Did that Great Awakening that we had here in the U.S. in the early 1700s or mid 1700s, did that have an impact in this as well?
Oh, a huge impact, and I'm so glad that you brought it up. I would have remembered it, but it's good that you brought it up right now, because it's so important. Remember, early on we established that ideas have consequences. That if you have certain beliefs, those beliefs will drive behavior and drive historical outcomes. So what happened in America, it was almost unthinkable that this small eastern seaboard of 13 colonies could overthrow the greatest military power in the world. First of all, these 13 colonies were disconnected from each other. You had the New England colonies, then you had New York, Manhattan, you had which included part of New Jersey, and then you had the Plymouth, the colony in Philadelphia revolving around William Penn. And you have, of course, the Virginia colony. Virginia was a very powerful part of American heritage. The first 4 presidents of the United States were Virginian. The only other one was Sam Adams, who was a Bostonian. So one could argue that so many of the ideas that drove America came really out of Virginia. And then you had North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So there were these 13 colonies, but they were not talking to each other. There was no telegraph even.
Right.
And the only way they knew of each other's existence would be couriers and the mail service, which was very sporadic, took a long time to get delivery, and sometimes the letter never got there because there was no U.S. mail. There was no formalized system. So
The
what
formalized
happened,
system doesn't do better today.
but what happened if we're to say that God was behind the awakening of William Bradford and John Winthrop, who likened their course as the Israelites leaving the promised land, so God also could recognize that the American people needed to be prepared to take on the greatest military power in the world. And so these disparate colonies need to be brought together. And so a great awakening, a spiritual awakening, starting in about 1730. And most people have heard that at least two names affiliated with a great awakening. It was John. We have George Whitefield, and of course Jonathan Edwards in Massachusetts. We have Jonathan Edwards in Massachusetts, and his preaching was so powerful that it just transformed people. They were convicted that they needed to live their lives differently. Whitefield was very different. I mean, almost a picture of contrast between these two great leaders of the Great Awakening. Whitefield was a bit of an entertainer, and he had a very booming voice. His voice was so booming, he befriended Ben Franklin, and of course Ben Franklin was a scientist, and Franklin was always curious about everything, and he couldn't figure out, he wanted to know how many people could hear George Whitefield preach in one place. And of course, they had no electronic
Right.
amplification. And he calculated that 25,000 people could hear, if they were gathered around George Whitefield speaking, they could hear him. 25,000.
That's unreal.
That would be like a Trump rally with no microphone. I mean,
Right.
picture that.
That's unreal.
But Whitefield wasn't just, what was unique about him was his energy and his commitment to reaching all the colonies. And of course, he had to do that on horseback. And he actually visited every single colony 7 times.
Oh, wow.
In the course of 20 years. It's said that he reached over 1 million people, and these would be adults primarily. And the population of the colonies at that time was only about 2.5 million. But it said that he spoke to many more than 1 million, because he visited, and of course people would go to hear him again and again. He had a huge influence on the Great Awakening, as did Jonathan Edwards. And so Americans came to have an affinity for one another. They came to view their lives as not just isolated in their own community and their own colony, but really that they were connected spiritually to other people. And there came to be pamphleteers that talked about independence, Patrick Henry and others. And this information began to spread through the colonies. And so when it came time to take up arms, there was a sense that there was support for it in most of the other colonies. Not a majority of support. Remember, it's usually the minority oftentimes determines the fortune of everybody else, because there's a lot of passivity in human nature, and not everybody
Right.
not everybody votes. Only people who really care go out and vote. So it said that the support of the American people for the War of Independence was only about 25%. 25% of the people were really quite persuaded that it was time for independence. And then there were loyalists, people that wanted to stay with England too. And there might have been almost 25% of the people that were loyalists. But in any case, the War of Independence really started in the Boston area, Lexington and Concord. It was called the Shot, heard around the world, remember?
Mm-hmm.
And then there was Bunker Hill. And so there was a standoff. So when this was happening, the colonists did decide we need to have a governing body for the colonies. And so the Articles of Confederation were drafted up, and there was a Confederation Congress that gathered in Philadelphia and began preparing for war. They chose George Washington as the commander-in-chief. And it's really appropriate to tell the story, the backstory of George Washington at this point, because he is a remarkable man.
And Scott, just so you know, we're getting close to the end of time too. So
Okay.
I just want to make certain, yeah, but I do want to know a little bit about George Washington because he is, I mean, you're right. His background is amazing on that.
Well, he had a military calling. He always, he really saw his life in the military. He loved horses. He was a great horseman. He was serving under General Braddock, the British general, in 1755. This is during the French and Indian War. And Washington was the junior most officer. He was a colonel. And there were officers of higher rank above him. Most of them were, almost all of them were British. And they were called to go free Fort Duquesne, which is up near what is now Pittsburgh. And the French occupied that fort. So Braddock's mission was to go take on the French and defeat them and reclaim that Fort Duquesne. Unfortunately, they were ambushed along the way in the valley of the Monongahela. And, and the Indians, who were the primary combatants more than the French, they found a perfect place for the ambush, an open field surrounded by trees. And the Indians were sharpshooters. They had really learned how to use firearms. And so one by one, they began shooting at the people on the horseback because they were told that everyone on horseback is an officer. So if you kill all the officers, we can get the rest pretty easily. So one by one, all those officers went down. But there was one they couldn't take down, and that was a very big man who happened to be George Washington. And fire as they would, and they had multiple sharpshooters to take this guy down. Washington lost 2 horses. He had 2 horses shot out from under him.
Wow.
On his 3rd horse, when he took stock of all the officers on the ground, dead or dying, and by this time they killed a lot of the soldiers too. And he said, I have to organize a retreat. I'm now the only officer. I have to organize a retreat. He did that successfully that night as he's decompressing from the horrible day. He takes off his coat and he finds that he has 4 bullet holes through his coat.
Oh, wow.
4. He knew right then and there that he had been protected by God. There was no other explanation for it. And we know this is a true story. He wrote letters that have been saved. He wrote a letter to his brother describing that God had protected him. So this kind of shaped Washington's life. So in the Revolutionary War, where he was the commander-in-chief, even though they were always outgunned, outnumbered, outtrained, and outfunded compared with the British, he always led courageously from the front on his horse. And he had such courage, he displayed such courage that it really mobilized the forces. And so even though Washington and the Continental Army had more battle defeats than they won, nonetheless, they prevailed for 6 years and they wore the British down. And so when they got the great victory at Yorktown, the British finally said, these people will never give up. This Washington man, this courageous guy, we're no match. I think it's time to, time to not only surrender here at Yorktown, but to arrange for America to become independent. And so that's the story, short story of the War of Independence.
It sounds like it sounds like he was almost the precursor of General Patton in a way. Clearly, there was some influence there when Patton was a big fan of history as well.
Yeah.
So we need to wrap up. So if people want to find out about the book, because you have all these other great stories in here from all these other different holidays that you talk about as far as our nation is concerned. Where do they go to find your book? I'm assuming Amazon is the best place.
Well, Amazon, the benefit of Amazon is that you can read reviews, a lot of reviews.
Okay.
So you can get a good feel for what's in the book by reading people's reviews. But you can Google my name, Scott S. Powell. Rediscovering America is the name of the book. Rediscovering America, and it was really written for a time such as this because we are now in the process of rediscovering our country.
And if they want to know more also about the Discovery Institute that you're part of, how do they find out about that?
Well, Discovery Institute is a very unique organization with a lot of great minds there. And you can find it by going to www.discovery.org, Discovery Institute. You can find my work, my name, Discovery Institute. Just Google my name and Discovery Institute, and I will come right up. A little background on me, and then all the archived articles that I've written. I've been with Discovery for about 13 years now.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. Well, that sounds great. Well, Scott, I thank you so much for coming on to the show. I greatly appreciate you being here. And look forward to having you back on, especially as we hit some of these other holidays. I like to sit down and talk to you about them before we get on. So, but again, thank you so much for having you on.
Sure. Thank you.